David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The voter intimidation is starting, my friends. Today's example is actually an in-uniform police officer doing it. This took place in Miami, Florida. A police officer in uniform with a Trump mask that says Trump no more BS, walking around a polling place. The officer is Daniel Ubeda, wearing a Trump 2020 mask inside a polling place at Miami's Government Center. Attorney Steve Simonides, who is also chairman of the Miami-Dade Democratic Party, says, quote, "He may have been going to vote, but he was in full uniform with the mask and a gun. That's voter intimidation. And indeed, it is illegal in the state of Florida. Florida's 2020 statutes 104.32, referring to political activities of state, county, and municipal officers and employees, says that no officer of the state or any county or municipality can use their authority to influence an election or to influence a vote, period. And importantly, that, quote, no employees of the state can participate in any political campaign while on duty. If you violate it, it's actually a misdemeanor in the first degree. Miami police immediately alerted to it by people who saw this. They tweeted about it saying, quote, "We are aware of the photograph being circulated of a Miami police officer wearing a political mask in uniform. This behavior is unacceptable, a violation of department policy, and is being addressed immediately." Now, of course, there's a bigger issue. This is an officer who broke the law. He shouldn't be working in law enforcement, period. But we have no national database of bad actor police officers. We have no such requirement. We likely won't anytime soon. As I mentioned months ago when the George Floyd protest started, in the context of the police reforms, I would like to see a national bad actors database, something that would be brutally fought to the death by police unions. And more than likely, we will get a sort of meaningless slap on the wrist coming for this officer. Don't worry, he won't do it again, at least not for 4 more years. Big consequences. And in all seriousness, someone sworn to uphold the law, breaking the law while in uniform. A police department is as good as its worst officer. And this is an individual, Daniel Ubeda, who may end up with a couple of weeks of paid administrative leave while they investigate what happened. Does anybody think that's going to teach this guy a lesson? But as I've said before, keep me posted on this stuff if you come across it. I got an email yesterday. I don't want to say too much because I want to look at it myself, but I got an email yesterday, not about intimidation. Well, actually, it sort of is. It's intimidation by text message. OK, I'm asking for more information and I'm going back and forth with the viewer to really vet the story. But I may have that for you tomorrow or the next day. But if you see intimidation, if you get intimidatory emails, if you see intimidation at polling places, let me know. Video is, of course, ideal if you can safely and legally record it. If you can't, let me know what happened. But the reports are starting to come in, and I can only imagine, because listen, they've said, right? Trump said, go and monitor polling places. They've said we are going to try to have law enforcement, possibly federal military at polling places. They've mentioned everything in passing at some point, and who knows what they're actually going to try to do. So help me get the word out if indeed you are seeing that. Hey, speaking of protests, there's a very important report from the Associated Press, which looked at the arrests that took place at and related to the various protests that we've seen around the country over the last several months. And the study found that most of the people arrested at the protests are not leftist radicals, are not affiliated with Antifa to the extent that one can be affiliated with Antifa. They are not anarchists or anarchists, as Donald Trump sometimes says, the way that Trump and his cronies and many Republicans have been portraying the small minority of individuals at protests. I don't call them protesters because the ones that are arrested, they're not protesting, they're doing other things. But let's reset a little bit before we get into the data. Since the George Floyd and anti-police brutality protests that we've seen, the Trumpian Republican line has been dangerous, violent, leftist, socialist, communist, Marxist anarchists, or some combination thereof, are wreaking havoc, destroying things, burning things down. The left is violent, and this is the future of Joe Biden's America, even though it's Donald Trump's America right now. Now, all along, we knew the protests have been mostly peaceful, and there have been provocateurs, there have been rioters who are not protesters, who are provoking and rioting and committing crimes. And it is a very, very small number of people. Okay. The Associated Press looked at the roughly 300 people arrested at the various protests and found that most of the people arrested, even though the protests are happening in cities, are suburban adults who came into the cities where the protests took place from the exact suburbs that Donald Trump says he needs to protect from the urban people, which often is code for non-white people. But of course, there are urban white people and urban black people, urban Hispanic people, etc. Understand that those are the people coming into the cities to create chaos, commit some crimes and getting themselves arrested. Now, of course, there are people who got arrested from the nearly 300 whose political views, if you were to sit down with them and do an interview, are left-leaning political views. But there are plenty whose views are right-wing. There are plenty who are sort of not political and just taking advantage of a situation to provoke. Most have no affiliation with any particular group. Some have pre-existing criminal records, some don't. Some were illegally carrying weapons at the times of their arrests. Some were not. But certainly almost no, this idea of ties to Antifa, almost non-existent. Most no previous criminality, period. The most common charges against those arrested are, number one, arson, followed by illegal possession of a firearm. Just those two crimes are about 45% of all the arrests. And then you've got some of these vague civil unrest, disorderly conduct, impeding a federal officer, some property damage, some failing to obey a lawful order. And when you look at the list, lots of these are these sort of BS charges equivalent to resisting arrest. And I'm certainly including disorderly conduct in that, not obeying a lawful order. That can be a police officer says, leave now, and you leave, but too slowly. And the officer said too slowly in the opinion of the officer. And then the officer says, you're not obeying a lawful order, interfering with law enforcement. These can be BS charges or they can be legitimate. In all of these 286, I believe, charges, the only court documents that even reference Antifa are one case in Boston where there was suspected Antifa activity that was being investigated. That's certainly not definitive. That's the one reference. And of course, in the midst of this, there are plenty of instances of right-wing militia and far-right extremists who have been arrested. 2 Missouri militia members, 3 Boogaloo movement members. That's another right-wing group, and so on. So we have a report now, an investigation, which tells us what we already suspected, but the right either doesn't understand or won't accept. The other obvious issue with saying a person is part of Antifa, as we've talked about before, is that Antifa is not an organization. It's more an ideology. Mostly it's just benignly being anti-fascist. Now, even I, as someone who has said I'm against many of the tactics that some operating under the name Antifa, the banner of Antifa, sometimes use, I am against fascism, but I'm not part of any organization. And there really is no organization, which is part of the double-edged sword, where you can accuse anyone of being part of an organization that isn't really an organization. It's like saying I'm a member of white nationalism, as an example. Well, okay, that's really an ideology. There are groups that are heavily white nationalist in nature, like the KKK, but being a member of white nationalism makes about as much sense as being a member of Antifa. The other really important element to think about is whether or not Antifa is a group or an extremist group. it's actually irrelevant to the findings. The people from the left who are in the streets protesting are generally not violent. And unlike the right, they've not been radicalized by some monolithic right-wing media apparatus or by Trump or by QAnon. They're just normal people asking for change. And that is a totally separate issue from whether Antifa is or isn't an organization. Almost everybody participating in these protests has nothing to do whatsoever with the ideology nor with the organization. So if you're surprised, let me know. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Remember that the David Pakman Show is primarily funded by memberships, which you can grab at joinpakman.com. We do have Hatriot Mail for you this week. Hatriot Mail really escalating, I guess I would say. Quick reminder about what Hatriot Mail is.
To the over 200,000 Americans who've died from COVID-19, you let it dominate your life, didn't you? Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
Lots of people very, very angry with me for some reason in advance of the election. Take a listen to this one as it needs very little introduction. But it is this is a viewer is weighing in on the Supreme Court nomination. That's how I would introduce it if it was not the rantings of a lunatic. Take a listen.
Soy boy, cuck boy, Pakman. Fill the seat. Winning, winning, winning. Trump forever. I'd put money up that Pakman is either a cuck or gay. Can tell this guy likes to gossip. That's what I think of when I see soft, pale intellectuals who aren't actually about America or freedom. And a Jew to boot. The full package.
So you've got a combination there of gender stereotypes about alpha and beta males, anti-Semitism, which is just a fixture of Hatriot Mail, and it has been for years, really just like a mishmash of nonsense. Now, this is a serious question. I actually want to hear from people on this, as opposed to many of the things I say I don't really want to hear from you. This one I really do. What kind of a job do you think folks who write emails like this have? Like, could this be an accountant that emailed me about being a soy boy, cuck boy? Is it possible that this is a pediatric oncologist that wrote me this? Like, I don't want to stereotype who would write such an email, but what do you imagine would be the day-to-day job of somebody like that? If they even have a job. I don't know the answer to that. What do you imagine? Let me know. And remember that you can use the coupon code HATRIOT40 to get 40% off the membership of your choice on my website, joinpakman.com. Here's the spelling, and there's confusion about the spelling. It's H-A-T, like a hat, H-A-T-R-I-O-T, hat riot, like the two words, H-A-T-R-I-O-T 40. 40% off the membership of your choice at joinpakman.com. You can just tell from watching Donald Trump's rallies this week that there's something new going on. There's a sort of desperate anger, I would call it, that wasn't really there before. And it culminated in humiliating fashion last night with Donald Trump at a rally in Erie, Pennsylvania, which started nearly 50 minutes late for no particular reason. I covered part of it live. Donald Trump telling the audience he doesn't even want to be there, but he's losing now. And he sort of has to be there. He doesn't want to, but he had to do it. Great way to get the audience on your side, right? Take a look.
Because, before the plague came in, I had it made. I wasn't coming to Erie. I mean, I have to be honest. There's no way I was coming. I didn't have to. I would have called you and said, hey, Erie, if you have a chance, get out. But we had this thing won. We were so far up. We had the greatest economy ever, greatest jobs, greatest everything. And then we got hit with the plague. And I had to go back to work. Hello, Erie. May I please have your vote?
I wouldn't be here if I didn't have to, because I screwed up the coronavirus response. Imagine if Barack Obama had ever said that. Imagine if Joe Biden said that during this election, or if Hillary Clinton had said that back in 2016. I really don't want to be here, but I had to come here to this lame place because I'm losing. And by the way, if you don't vote for me, I will never come back, which Donald Trump has been saying in Pennsylvania and in North Carolina and in many other places. And by the way, this idea that coronavirus had to hurt him, that inevitably the virus hurt him, so now he has to campaign. World leaders who did a good job with the virus are cruising to re-election. Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand sailed to overwhelming re-elections and a bigger labor majority than I think New Zealand has ever seen because she handled the coronavirus properly. As I've said before, if Trump had handled the virus properly, Biden would have no shot right now. So that's also completely wrong. Then maybe the most humiliating moment of this rally, Donald Trump saying nobody wants him.
Really? I can't believe it. You better give me the credit, damn it, I'll tell you. What I've gone through, the drug companies, they're spending a fortune on fake ads. They don't want me. They don't want me. China doesn't want me. Iran doesn't want me. Nobody wants me. Nobody. Erie wants me.
It's easy to write this stuff off as merely the rantings of a madman, but I think there is something real here, which is Donald Trump does see the polls. And even though publicly he says he's winning, he knows he might lose. He does realize that everything he's doing is sinking him further and further. He does the first debate, the polls collapse. He continues to crater in many important states. And I think Trump is cognizant of that. And that's why you're seeing this attitude from Donald Trump. Trump then still confused about how stealth planes work. Trump still seems to think that stealth planes are invisible to the naked eye rather than invisible to enemy radar.
We now have the greatest equipment we've ever had. We are the envy of Russia and China and everybody in the world. We have the best missiles and rockets and tanks and planes. F-35, stealth, you can't see it. Other than that, it's not so great. You can't see it. I went to one of the pilots, I said, how good is this plane? Well, it's really good. Why is it good? Because the enemy can't see it. I said, I don't know too much about what you do. Sounds good to me.
Continuing that old trope. And then a bizarre moment when Republican Congressman Mike Kelly says, no flu is going to keep Trump down, again rehabilitating this false notion that coronavirus is the flu.
This is the time. This is your solemn oath to America. We're going to make America great again, because of Donald J. Trump. There's no flu that's going to keep this man down. He makes the Energizer Bunny look like a deadhead.
No flu keeping Trump down, but 952 Americans did die yesterday as we approach spike number 3 of coronavirus. Here's a completely incoherent thought from Donald Trump. I can't even pretend to explain this one to you. It's a verbal ink blot. Take a look.
You seen what's been going on? How well we're doing? Did you see the recent poll just came out? 56% of the people want to be here, not 4 years ago. They want to be with us in what we're rounding the turn on the pandemic. 56%, and it's a record, epic job growth, safe vaccines that quickly end the pandemic. It's ending. Normal life, that's all we want. You know what we want? Normal life.
Just not making any sense. And then Trump, I guess, wrapping up sort of early yesterday because it was cold in Erie, Pennsylvania. Trump sounding sedated by the end. Listen to the slow motion version of Trump's now ubiquitous rally closing.
That I know you well. A lot of time in this incredible land, this beautiful place, this place of history. The incredible people of Pennsylvania. We have made America powerful again. Our military never been like this. Remember at the beginning when the overrated general said to me, sir, we have no ammunition. I said, no president should ever have that. No president should ever hear those words. Sir, we have no ammunition. We now have so much ammunition that even Mike would be impressed.
wrapping up there with a sort of sedated sounding nod to the military industrial complex. Trump tonight in Charlotte, North Carolina, and then, of course, tomorrow night, the second and what will be the final presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump. I will be covering it live on YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook. I hope you will join me at about 8:30 p.m. Eastern time. And of course, continued coverage, clips, polling, memes, and other hijinks on the David Pakman Show Instagram at David Pakman Show. Again, if you want to see me voting, very strongly voting over the weekend, catch video of me voting on my Instagram page, david.pakman. We'll take a quick break. Our deep dive into systemic racism coming up after the break.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
In the 1960s in the United States, with the passing of the Civil Rights Act, we saw what many consider to be sort of the official end of the absolute most explicit and formal types of government racism. When we ended mandated segregation, we outlawed many other types of racial discrimination. But since then, and really to this day, Black and Hispanic Americans continue to suffer from a variety of social and economic inequities with regard to wealth, education, health outcomes, cycles of crime and incarceration. The list is a mile long when we're talking about socioeconomic adversities that disproportionately impact populations of color. Over the past 50 or 60 years, in the time since the Civil Rights Movement, we've seen many racial equality movements try to illuminate and put a spotlight on and address these problems. And these movements tend to acknowledge that these problems are the ripple effects of historical institutional racism like slavery and Jim Crow. And these movements have pushed for solutions that are designed to help these groups in particular as remedies for problems that impact them disproportionately. This has taken the form of affirmative action, scholarships for minority students, busing to integrate schools, federal financial support for historically Black colleges, government programs that help minority businesses. These are all forms of action that solve or try to solve race-based problems in the United States. Over the past half century, what we've also seen consistently in parallel is pushback against these racial equality initiatives. Here are a few clips of some popular conservatives making comments which I believe accurately sum up the prevailing right-wing narrative on systemic racism with regard to socioeconomics.
One could certainly say during the Jim Crow era, when African Americans couldn't vote, that's systemic racism. You have things in the system that are contributing to racism. Is systemic racism still a reality today?
It is not a reality. It is the opposite of a reality. It's an illusion. If you can point to me to the law or the practice that's in place that somehow keeps me out, if there's two people that are working the exact same and putting out the same, exerting the same amount of effort, and you're going to tell me that as a Black person I can't get ahead, it doesn't exist.
There are lots of rich Black people in America, and there are lots of poor white people in America.
Oh, yeah.
So because Black people in the United States are disproportionately poorer than white people in the United States, it's actually, it's ignoring the real problem, which is how do we get poor people to be richer?
Systemic racism does not exist. There are no laws in America, meaning the system. Doesn't mean racism doesn't exist. Racism exists. There are people who are racist, and you should do everything you can to show them that their ideas are wrong, and that you should not be judging someone based on their race, of course. But the idea that there is systemic racism, meaning that there are laws in place that treat Black people differently or Asian people differently or white people differently, simply doesn't exist. If you can get an economy that's as free as possible, you will have more and more people, regardless of the color of their skin, being able to partake in an economy.
So those comments cover a bunch of the predominant views from the right on systemic racism. Those were clips of three of the most popular right-wing online broadcasters. So the first thing I want to point out is they are defining systemic racism so narrowly that it would only refer to racism by the government and only the most explicit and official forms of government racism, like Jim Crow, for example. And that's how they're able to say that systemic racism doesn't exist. If someone's constantly asserting something that everyone already accepts as true, such as slavery and Jim Crow no longer exist, it's likely that they're either accidentally or purposefully misunderstanding what they are trying to argue against. That's what's happening here. I've never encountered someone who asserts that systemic racism is a problem today while defining racism in such a narrow way. People usually use the term systemic racism to denote any type of racial biases, formal or informal, by a system or someone acting on behalf of a system, which could take the form of racial bias by police officers or by a law enforcement system, racial bias by people hiring at a company, racial bias in education, like a standardized test that puts certain racial groups at a disadvantage. It doesn't even necessarily have to be racism by an individual, importantly. It could just be a system doing something that in practice disadvantages members of a certain group on the basis of their race. And I think that the concept requiring a little bit of nuance is exactly why some people get confused, some people get defensive about the word racism being involved. So maybe we can have a separate conversation about finding a better term, which is fine. But that's what people mean when they say there is active systemic racism present in the year 2020. So I think a lot of conservatives are confused about the definition if they act as though it's synonymous only with slavery and Jim Crow, or some of them are straw manning in bad faith to avoid actually engaging with the reality on the ground. But the conservatives I played in the clips, what they also seem to be saying is that systemic racism, as someone like me would define it, doesn't exist. Their sentiment is slavery and Jim Crow are over. Black people no longer face any types of disadvantages. There are no systemic biases against black people. There are no lingering effects from historical, institutional inequality, unfairness that still leave the deck stacked against minority individuals. Black and white people on average have identical opportunity to succeed, they would assert. The other thing they seem to be saying is that because they don't believe those racial biases exist, we shouldn't be looking at minority poverty through the lens of race in order to solve it with racial social justice action. They say we should instead look at black poverty, for example, as an arbitrary piece of poverty as a whole, and we should try to solve black poverty merely by fixing poverty as a whole. And in addition to saying that racial solutions to, for example, black or Hispanic poverty are unnecessary, often they will add that those racial solutions dismiss, ignore, or belittle white poverty, and they discount the personal responsibility of non-white individuals to improve their own lives. But it's not surprising that that's the direction conservatives would go, because each of those pieces fits beautifully into the conservative meta-narratives that we've been following. For example, racial inequality is generally overblown. Identity politics is bad. Government intervention is the wrong way to fix anything. Capitalism and meritocracy ultimately are the answers to everything. What conservatives like these are not realizing is that there are social and economic problems today in the United States that affect minorities in specific ways. Black folks as a group do have certain types of particular disadvantages, and to admit that is a reality doesn't mean that you're deriding the poverty of other races or in general. And it doesn't mean you're devaluing anybody's individual responsibility. It doesn't mean that there aren't things we can also be doing generally to help everybody in a situation of hardship, regardless of race. Of course, we want to be thinking about those solutions too. And I talk about those solutions every day. I might even agree with somebody like Ben Shapiro when he says that the mere existence of a black-white poverty gap alone is not necessarily a justification for using race as the context to fix black poverty. The fact that black folks are impoverished at a higher rate than white people by itself might not justify racial solutions as opposed to solutions that improve the lives of all groups. But what these people on the right seem never to recognize is that certain opportunity gaps also still exist. Not only do black folks in many respects have worse outcomes on average, black folks also have diminished opportunity to improve those outcomes compared to white people on average. That's what these conservatives are missing. And it's the reason why it is actually useful to explore certain solutions that are tailored towards certain particular racial inequalities. In some ways, black and white poverty can be different. There are many metrics that illustrate gaps between a black person and a white person of the same income. There was a groundbreaking study by Stanford and Harvard researchers from 2018, which combined census data on race with IRS tax returns, allowing them to compare the income of parents with the income of their grown children over the span of 1989 to 2015 for the purpose of tracking intergenerational mobility, which is the degree to which children economically surpass their parents or fall behind. And what they found is that downward mobility occurs at a much higher rate among black Americans than among white Americans when you compare black and white people with similar incomes. This was true even among the children of higher income parents of both races. Children of white parents in the top fifth of the income distribution have a 41% chance of staying at that income level. Children of black parents in that highest income level only have an 18% chance of staying at that income level. So regardless of how much money your parents make, if you are black, you are less likely to achieve the economic status of your parents or higher. Sadly, I can already imagine some people are going to butt in with, oh, well, maybe it has something to do with intelligence or single parenthood or something like that. The study found that the black-white mobility gap is entirely driven by black and white males. There was very little gap between black and white females, which would rule out genetic factors between races as an explanation, if that's your sort of thing to look at. The study also looked at family structure, and it found that the huge gap is there, regardless of whether children came from one or two parent homes, which debunks the conservative idea that lower marriage rates are responsible. But a factor that does tend to powerfully predict economic mobility is the average income of the neighborhood in which a child was raised. A study by Harvard economists published in 2015 showed overwhelming evidence for this. The researchers looked at 16 years of tax records to track pairs of children and parents, and they found that the affluence of a child's neighborhood is the single best predictor of their long-term upward mobility. The amount of money in an area where a child grows up is strongly correlated with that child's ability to achieve more socioeconomic success than their parents. A study was published in 2015 by the American Academy of Political and Social Science, conducted by researchers at Stanford, by looking at census data, which found that among black and white families with similar incomes, white families are much more likely to live in neighborhoods with higher average incomes. And of course, this means that the white family is more likely to have access to better schools, better childcare, better parks, better transportation options. The list of advantages in a high income neighborhood relative to a low income neighborhood is a very, very long list. And between a black and white family of similar income, the difference between the average incomes of their neighborhoods is not small. It's huge. So to put all of this together, we have the mobility gap between black and white people of similar incomes. The mobility of anyone, regardless of race, tends to be predicted by the average income of the neighborhood where they grew up. And we see that a black family with the same income as a white family is more likely to live in a poorer neighborhood. And that's because black people tend to live near other black people, and black people have lower incomes than white people on average. And of course, that is what we call racial housing segregation, the geographic separation of races. And it is a racial issue. So we've demonstrated one of many examples of a social problem in 2020, which can be usefully analyzed in terms of race, and it warrants racial justice action. The problem is that black folks have less upward mobility than white folks. The cause of the problem is racial housing segregation, and the solution would be integrating housing to a greater degree. There are so many other examples of social problems today that demand racial justice solutions in education, healthcare, the justice system. I'd have nowhere near enough time in this video to go into each and every one of them. So let's flesh out this example we're dealing with, housing segregation. Before we start talking about solutions to segregation, we should contemplate how the housing segregation that exists today came to be. A lot of people think that people of the same races ended up living in the same areas accidentally or as a result of personal choice. But actually, most of today's racial segregation in every city across America results from explicitly racist government policies. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th century, many American cities passed zoning ordinances prohibiting black people from moving onto a block that was majority white. Starting in 1934, the federal government gave white people better access to affordable mortgages while designating black neighborhoods in cities across America as zones where banks should not offer mortgages. This was known as redlining, which encouraged white people to move to homogeneously white suburbs, and it trapped black people in decaying neighborhoods. Also in the 1930s, the Public Works Administration built tens of thousands of public housing complexes all over the country, all of which had a designation for which racial group was allowed to live there. And almost all of them were either all white or all black. And much of the racial segregation that it caused is still present today. There are plenty of other instances of government mandating racial housing segregation. Deliberate, codified government racism is what gave us almost all of the housing segregation we see today. And now white people and black people are more segregated from one another than white people are segregated from Asian or Hispanic people, as examples, and more so than poor and non-poor people are segregated from one another. And black-white segregation puts a hugely unfair burden on black people. It has much worse effects for a black family living in a black neighborhood who have the same income and education as a white family living in a white neighborhood. The average middle-class black family lives in a neighborhood with a higher poverty rate than the average low-income white person. Segregation also prevents home values from appreciating in black neighborhoods because of white folks' reluctance to buy a home in a black neighborhood, even when all other attributes of homes and neighborhoods are equal, which, by the way, is an example of systemic racism happening actively in the year 2020. And it's a type of systemic racism with a huge impact on black wealth, since someone's home is often their largest financial asset. So the crucial thing here is that higher poverty rates in the neighborhood means lower quality resources for everyone who lives there. Segregation is the biggest barrier between black people and higher income, wealth, better education, healthcare, employment opportunities, and so on. One might even be able to say that today, the government's refusal to integrate housing more effectively to fix the problems that government created originally could itself be another example of ongoing systemic racism in 2020. The government not doing something is just as much a policy decision as the government doing something. Sure, someone like Ben Shapiro can sit back and say, yeah, okay, whatever happened in the past with racism and segregation was bad, but now that the government has stopped actively mandating segregation, we can just wipe the slate clean. We can just blame individual black people for being poor. But that would be a complete misunderstanding of the forces that created these problems and the forces that would be necessary to fix them. Government has a ton of power, obviously, and it used this power to segregate for a long time. That same amount of power would be required to undo it. This is where we get to the distinction between desegregation and integration. Desegregation is when a government stops separating people. Integration is the process of unseparating those same people, which has not happened. So we're currently stuck in a state of segregation. Essentially, in a way, the Civil Rights Act did not accomplish as much as conservatives seem to think it did. It didn't hit the reset button on racial inequality. Racial groups in the United States are not on a level playing field. So what can government do to counteract segregation as a way to give black people more economic opportunity? Well, to start with, we could reinstitute the Obama-era policy of requiring localities that receive federal money for housing to identify and try to remedy housing practices that promote racial bias. The policy that was suspended by the Trump administration, which Donald Trump completely blew out of proportion in terms of what it did. And Donald Trump has made clear that he has no interest in dealing with that issue. And in fact, in his personal past, has a history of racial housing discrimination. Commenting on his elimination of this anti-racist policy, Trump actually tweeted, "I am happy to inform all of the people living in their suburban lifestyle dream that you will no longer be bothered or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood. Enjoy." That's another example of institutional racism in 2020, if I've ever seen one. Another step we could take to counter segregation by reducing housing discrimination is to increase the use of fair housing testers, who are individuals who pose as potential buyers and renters, to gather information on possible instances of illegal racial housing discrimination, because this discrimination tends to push Black people out of white areas. Tests like these have been funded by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and they've uncovered a staggering amount of racial discrimination. For example, they did a test in Chicago in 2018 and identified racial discrimination 27% of the time. There's some more current systemic racism as an example for you. Nevertheless, HUD does not fund these tests anywhere near the level that matches how pervasive and destructive we've observed this problem to be. We have to be better about enforcing anti-housing discrimination laws that are already on the books. Government could also be bolstering inclusionary zoning policies, which require home builders to make sure that portions of new housing units are affordable to low and moderate income people, to eliminate the financial barriers that often end up keeping poor Black families from finding an affordable home in a good neighborhood. We could also be using more federal housing subsidies to help lower income Black families move into better neighborhoods. The low income housing tax credit could be used to develop subsidized rental housing in non-poor neighborhoods. There is great new research that illustrates that what we have been doing with this has had huge payoffs, especially for the kids of low-income families. There are many other strategies we could be using to disperse Black families so that lower-income households aren't so concentrated. New policies that can be implemented and through better funding and enforcement of initiatives that already exist could be significantly beneficial. But I wanted to explore just racial housing segregation as an example to illustrate some points about systemic racism and how much can be done about it. It's a topic that is always relevant and worthy of a deep dive, but especially right now with everything going on with Black Lives Matter, the discussions around race that are happening over the past few months, while they've had the country's attention, Black folks in the U.S. and allies of all kinds have been trying to shed light on a number of really important problems in the country, things that this country has to start dealing with. It's way overdue. But I'm seeing some people actually confused about what are even the starting points for these conversations. The reality is racism can take many different forms. Some people just have an overly simplistic conception of what racism is. People start talking about systemic racism. Conservatives respond with, I have no idea what you're talking about. We have no more slavery. Jim Crow is over. We ended that a long time ago. So racial injustice no longer exists. That perspective misunderstands deliberately or accidentally what systemic racism is, and it ignores the fact that systemic racism exists and is just another form of racism. We also have to refute the common conservative notion that Black hardships can only be productively discussed in the context of hardship or poverty in general, instead of acknowledging additional racial components that are often involved. There are some issues that are more accurately understood when you take into account racial injustices that may be at play so that you can solve them with specially catered solutions.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com. The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
So the bad news will just not stop coming for Donald Trump. A bombshell New York Times article this week, yesterday in fact, revealing that Donald Trump has an undisclosed bank account in China. And it exposes a whole series of Chinese business pursuits. This is, of course, the same Donald Trump that has been going after China for the virus and going after China for doing this and that unfair thing to the United States. The same Donald Trump that has been repeating for months that if Joe Biden were to be president, China would control Biden. The same Trump whose Republican Party has been going after Joe Biden's son, Hunter Biden, for opening a bank account in China. That Donald Trump has a bank account in China and a long history of trying to do business with China. The New York Times has continued to analyze the tax records that were the basis for the blockbuster story about Trump paying no federal taxes in 10 of the last 15 years from a few weeks ago, which feels like years ago, by the way. That story was just a few weeks ago. And the New York Times has now learned that Donald Trump has bank accounts in Britain, in Ireland, and yes, in China. The Chinese bank account, shocker, was not on Donald Trump's public financial disclosures because it's held under a convenient corporate name. And that Chinese bank account paid $188,000 in taxes to the Chinese government between 2013 and 2015. Understand that that means Trump's business paid more tax to the Chinese government in those years than Trump paid in the United States federally. And Donald Trump is saying Biden has the China problem. And we know that Trump projects all the time. Trump accuses others of being corrupt when he's corrupt. Trump accuses others of nepotism when he's the king of nepotism. Trump accuses others of receiving softball interviews when he gets weekly softball interviews from Fox and Friends and Sean Hannity and Maria Bartiromo and Eric Bolling yesterday and the whole cast at Fox News. But this is another level of projection with China, claiming for weeks now that Hunter Biden has this and that financial connection to China, and it's a problem for Joe Biden and so on. And all along, Donald Trump has had an undisclosed Chinese bank account. And this puts a huge list of actions related to China under the microscope once again. Many Chinese government proposals came after Trump became president. Ivanka Trump won Chinese trademark approvals for her, was it clothing or handbags, after she joined the White House staff, and on and on and on. And all of these now need to be scrutinized under a new light. Not that they didn't need to be scrutinized before. It's a perfect amalgam of possible nepotism, cronyism, and corruption, which I don't think we will ever know the full scope of. I know there's this idea that after Trump leaves, whether it's in a few months or in 4 years, there will be investigations and we'll eventually get to the bottom of it. I don't think we will. And let me just give you one more example. And again, each one of these examples could be a huge story, a major investigation by itself. And I assure you, if this was a story about Chelsea Clinton during a Hillary presidency instead of about Ivanka, it would be a huge story. This, from the same New York Times investigation, says, quote, not long after winning the 2016 election, Mr. Trump reported selling a penthouse in one of his Manhattan buildings for $15.8 million to a Chinese American businesswoman named Xiaoyan Chen, who bought the unit previously occupied by Ivanka Trump and her husband, Jared Kushner, in an off-market transaction. Ms. Chen runs an international consulting firm and reportedly has high-level connections to government and political elites in China. Circumstantially, that is as much of a red flag or more ripe for investigation than anything that we have about Hunter Biden and Joe Biden right now. By itself, that sale could be a huge story to investigate. But again, we may never know the full scope of what's gone down and what favors have been offered and done in exchange for what. One of you emailed me about this story saying, what is the breaking point for Trump supporters and for Republicans with this stuff? Republican congressmen all know Trump may be tied to all of these different countries. What's the breaking point? The answer is we're 13 days away from the election. There is no breaking point. If Trump wins, they win in a sense, and they just try to maintain power. If Trump loses, they start to distance themselves from Trump, pretend they never really supported him. He wasn't really a Republican, and move on. And you could apply that prediction not just to Republican elected officials, but just your average run-of-the-mill Trump supporter. And we will see what the New York Times has in the next 13 days based on these documents. So this next story started to develop last night, and I have to tell you, I can't wait. I am really like a kid on Christmas morning, and yeah, I'm Jewish, but the metaphor just works. Like a kid on Christmas morning waiting for video to be released. Because Donald Trump yesterday was interviewed for an upcoming episode of 60 Minutes, and we've learned that in the middle of the interview, Trump abruptly and furiously got up and left, ending the interview with 60 Minutes correspondent Leslie Stahl, and then started tweeting ridiculous things about the interview. This has to be seen to be believed. The reporting is that in the interview, Trump became frustrated with the questions that Leslie Stahl was asking. That tracks perfectly with Trump's displeasure at being asked real questions, and in particular, in situations where he can't weasel his way out. The example from last week's town hall where Savannah Guthrie actually pressed Trump about his obvious lies as to when was he tested? Was he tested for coronavirus before the debate? And Trump just obviously lying and being dishonest. And Trump lost it on Savannah Guthrie, saying she was terrible, horrible, all this stuff. Same thing happened with 60 Minutes. After about 45 minutes of the 60 Minutes interview, Trump gets up and leaves and just doesn't come back. But he was highly, highly triggered. First, Trump tweeted a video of the interviewer Leslie Stahl not wearing a mask at the White House as an attack on her. We later learned that this was just moments after Trump abruptly left the interview. And Leslie Stahl, of course, being on camera, had removed her mask. And she was talking to producers about, like, is Trump coming back or is this over? She hadn't yet put her mask on. Trump attacking her for that. That's already weird. But then Trump bizarrely tweeting about the interview itself that, quote, I am pleased to inform you that for the sake of accuracy in reporting, I am considering posting my interview with Leslie Stahl of 60 Minutes prior to airtime. This will be done so that everybody can get a glimpse of what a fake and biased interview is all about. Everyone should compare this terrible electoral intrusion with the recent interviews of sleepy Joe Biden. So I guess the implication is maybe Trump has the raw video of the entire interview, or maybe Trump's just lying. Who the hell knows? But apparently a reporter asking real questions is considered an intrusion on the electoral process now, per Donald Trump. This is a joke, guys. We are a joke. The country is a joke. This man is a joke. It really can't continue. And in normal situations, a president being unable to handle a 60 Minutes interview, walking out, it would be a national scandal. If Barack Obama had done this, it would be 24/7 on right-wing news saying the president can't handle it. What an embarrassment. He can't stand the heat. If he can't stand up to Leslie Stahl, how can he stand up to Xi and Putin and Kim Jong? Right? All that stuff. If it had been Obama. With Trump, Trump has so weaponized his followers against the media in a dystopian act of hostility that the Trumpists are furious. If you look at the places online where the Trumpists hang out, the Trumpists are furious with Leslie Stahl and with 60 Minutes. But what we can be sure of is that if Trump walked out, the interview must have been really bad, because even interviews that you and I recognize as having gone badly for Donald Trump, Trump thinks he did well. So if even Trump thinks he didn't do well in the interview, it must be a complete disaster. If Trump flees the interview and starts slamming the interviewer on Twitter, you know it went really, really bad. And I hope that this is released Sunday. Very much looking forward to it. We have a voicemail number. That number is 2192 P. Here is one of our favorite callers from West Texas. Take a listen to what he had to say.
Yes, David, this is the guy from West Texas again. I see our president's doing the same thing he did with Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
Do me a favor, though. So now he's telling the voters, I'm not going to pass any stimulus bill unless you vote for me, and then after you vote for me and I get elected, I'll give you some money.
Right.
It's the same damn crap.
Okay, yeah, that's exactly right. And we talked about that last week, Trump saying, if you elect me, I will do a middle-class tax cut. Well, hold on. I thought you already did it, but if you didn't, why didn't you? And if you did, why are you promising the same thing again? Trump with the payroll tax cut. I will defer it until my second term and then make it a permanent deferral if you reelect me. It's Trump saying, I need you to do me a favor. You are absolutely right. And there are more examples of it that we've covered. And certainly, I am sure more that will come up. On the bonus show today, the battle over that second coronavirus stimulus bill is getting completely outrageous, with the points of view from Democrats, Pelosi, Trump, McConnell, the Republican Senate at large. We're going to discuss it on today's bonus show. We will also talk about the Supreme Court decision allowing a 3-day extension for Pennsylvania mail-in ballots. That is a decision that could determine the election. Most likely it won't. But if we were to say which one state could swing the election, Pennsylvania would be on the list, and we're going to talk about it. And then lastly, a majority now say the Senate should confirm Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. What happened? What changed? We will discuss all of those stories and more on today's bonus show. How do you get the bonus show? It's very easy. You go to joinpacman.com and you sign up. Coupon code is available if you want a discount. Don't feel obligated. It's available to anybody who wants it. You can use the coupon code 2020NOW, all one word, all lowercase, and that will save you 66% off of the cost of a membership. I will see you on the bonus show, otherwise tomorrow. And remember, tomorrow night, starting about a half hour before the presidential debate, about 8:30 p.m. Eastern time, we will be live on YouTube, Twitch, and Facebook. I hope you will join me then.